Okay, so I know this is maybe a bit of a weird video for my channel. I know I mostly make videos about Magic the Gathering and all, but I also have a job working for a Magic YouTube channel now, so I barely even upload here. So from now on, I'm mostly going to upload weird videos like this here. So anyway, I'm a Sonic fan now, and a big part of why is the IDW comics. These were a surprisingly great read, and I would absolutely recommend them to anyone who's a fan of these characters already, or even just anyone who's on the younger side of things. In fact, I enjoyed reading them so much that it made me really want to talk about these comics, and unfortunately, I've been given a platform that allows me to do just that. Plus, the comic just finished its latest arc with its 75th issue, a big milestone. So now is a pretty great time for a retrospective type video on the entire series. Of course, any sort of actual retrospective would take way too long for you to make, and a video would cease to be relevant by the time I released it. So I needed a different plan. After watching way too many Shave Rolls Productions videos, I decided to rank every arc in the comics so far because I thought it'd be fun, and it's not like being original is a prerequisite to making videos on YouTube or anything. Now, the term arc is pretty subjective, and there's no hard cutoff for when any one arc begins or ends. And if you think that I'm going to rank every single issue of this comic or something, then I'm sorry to say that my level of autism just isn't quite high enough for something like that. I've taken the liberty of chopping the comic up into 12 distinct arcs based on where I think it makes most sense to consider a story having started or ended. Also, I will be spoiling things all over the place in this video, so if you don't want to get spoiled, I suggest you go read the comics and then come back and watch this video. Trust me, you won't regret it. I mean, if you care enough about Sonic comics to click on this video, then you probably won't regret it. And with that, I think we're just ready to start. Of course, we'll be starting with the absolute worst arc in the series, which is... So this is a weird arc to start off with, mainly because it isn't really an arc at all. The first couple of issues are about Amy meeting up with Knuckles, then we get Mimic infiltrating the Restoration, then there's a small story about the Chaotix, then Surgeon Kit joined the Restoration, and then there's a one-off about Sonic and Tails going to find a Chaos Emerald. None of these stories have any thematic or emotional cohesion, or even really any plot relevance. It is literally just 4 disconnected stories that sort of set up for the Phantom Rider arc, and that's it. I think a lot of people would call this segment of the comic filler, but I disagree with how people use that word generally. People will call literally anything that's not directly pushing the plot forward filler. The thing is, that's not really what the word meant when it was getting popular. Filler has a very derogatory connotation online that I think actual filler has earned. However, real filler are sections of stories that can be cut without losing anything of value. However, people will call perfectly fine parts of stories that are just a bit slow filler. I really disagree with this because a lot of those slower sections are necessary to telling a good story. There are a lot of filler chapters in this comic that are mostly just used to wind things down after the bigger arcs, which is really necessary in a long-form story like this to set up things for the next big storyline. There's probably a better term for this, but if we were to call the main plot-heavy sections of the story the meat, then we could call these kind of stories the fat. They're connective tissue, and they're important for the body of the work itself to function properly, or for the meal to taste good if you want to go with that analogy, but if you get too much fat, then you're just left with an unsatisfying meal. And hey, that's a great transition into the problem with this arc. It is 7 straight issues of fat with no meat to balance it out at all. I think this segment of the comic really soured a lot of the fandom on the comic in general, because I've seen a ton of videos from around a year ago when this arc was being published that were extremely negative. And while I binged the whole comic so it wasn't as bad, this part definitely still felt like it was dragging on for way too long. Hell, that's why I'm ranking this as an arc unto itself anyway. Normally, I would just group the fat issues with whatever part of the comic I thought would make the most sense to group as one arc. But this section of the comic is so long that I can't easily group it as either a part of the Urban Warfare or Phantom Rider arcs. It's longer than Urban Warfare and is as long as Phantom Rider if you go by issue count. Phantom Rider is basically 8 issues because issue 75 is double length, but that doesn't really change what we're talking about here. There are multiple entire arcs of this comic that only take 4 issues to resolve. Having a 7-issue span where no major plot happens is insane, especially because this comic releases its issues monthly. Yeah, it took half a year for this segment of the comic to come out. It doesn't matter how good these one-shots are. If they're anything besides being absolutely life-changing, it's gonna feel disappointing. And as for the quality of these one-shots themselves, they're fine. We get a lot of cute interactions between the characters, and there are moments in here that I genuinely really like. The part where Mimic calls Surgeon Kit codependent actually got a laugh out of me, and honestly, that entire issue was a fun read. A lot of the issues are fun, but it's hard to keep someone's attention for that long of a period of time without something more than just cute art and fun character interactions. Now, this structural issue is already enough for me to rank this at the bottom of all of the arcs in IDW, but unfortunately, this stretch of the comic also includes maybe my least favorite individual issues of the entire comic. Issues 63 and 64 were really infamous on their release, and while I wasn't that upset with them at first, as the Phantom Rider arc went on and the plot beats they set up became relevant, I grew increasingly frustrated with these issues. These issues are a really aggravating read, mostly because it's one of the few times in the comic that it feels like characters are doing things just because the plot needs them to, and not because it makes sense for them to act that way. These are the issues where Mimic infiltrates the Restoration, and basically every character in the issues catches the idiot ball at some point so that plot can happen. Mimic shows his tail to Silver for literally no reason. It only puts him at more risk, and Mimic should know that there's at least a good chance that Silver survives the Badnik attack. Whisper, after hearing that Mimic might be infiltrating the Restoration, doesn't go and talk to any of her friends like a normal person, and instead stalks Duo like a creep with Silver. And when they get caught, instead of trying to play it off, Whisper then brings up the whole I think Duo might be Mimic thing, only after being weird, so that now Lanolin has a good reason to just assume that they're overreacting. And then, when Duo leaves, Silver fucking assaults him, giving Mimic the perfect cover to take a dive and get them off of his back. All of these incredibly brash decisions are being made by characters who have normally shown far more restraint in stressful situations. At no point do any of these decisions feel justified for any of these characters to make. It's very clear that this is just forced drama for the sake of letting Mimic infiltrate the good guys' headquarters. Also, this is less important, kind of bordering on a nitpick, but issues 63 and 64 are about Mimic joining Clutch and then infiltrating the Restoration. Then we take a break for 2 issues for some stuff with the Chaotix and a short story with Cream. Then we go back for issue 67 for Surgeon Kit to also join Clutch and then infiltrate the Restoration, and it's like, didn't we literally just do this plotline a couple months ago? I mean, it is a better issue overall because it trades the forced drama of Mimic's infiltration for the actually earned drama between Surge and Kid and all the other characters who they had some bad blood with. Still, a part of me feels like there had to be a way to tie both of these stories together into a way that felt more cohesive and efficient. Though these problems really aren't the main flaw with the arc, it's the structural problems at the end of the day. The arc just lasts too long, and frankly, in a better version of the comic, it wouldn't have qualified for this list at all. I don't want to be too arrogant and say that I know how this should have been written or ask for things that for some reasons I'm not privy to just weren't in the cards for the comic, but I really do think that having these plot beats be wrapped up in one larger story somehow would have made the comic a lot more fun to read. Again, that may not have been possible, and what we did get is still a series of on their own fine issues for the most part, but the arc is just not as good as the rest of the run. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, we can move on to the actual arcs of IDW Sonic and why I think that some of them aren't quite as great as others. I have no idea if anyone agrees with me on this one, but I did not enjoy Urban Warfare all that much. A big part of this may be that it came off of the back of what I'm calling the Operation Remaster Saga, which is a really good arc, but geez, did this arc just not feel all that special. And the weird thing is that if you just told me what the arc was on paper, I would have expected it to be really good. The Eggperial City itself is a really cool setting. Shadow finally gets a moment in the comic where he's not acting like Dragon Ball Abridged Vegeta, and the art and action in the arc is phenomenal. On paper, it sounds like a fine idea for an arc, so why am I ranking it so low? Well, for starters, I never really felt like the stakes were all that high. The Imperial City is never really shown as that big of a threat. Okay, sure, it is strip mining the surrounding environment and could overtake the surrounding area and eventually overtake nearby cities and towns or whatever, but those are pretty distant worries, you know? It's not exactly something that's immediately scary in the way that the metal virus or a forest fire or someone actively trying to commit murder are. This also extends to Eggman's new weapon in the arc, the spatial displacement trap, or whatever it's called. Now, technically, these are really powerful traps, but several characters get caught by them on screen, and it doesn't actually seem to hurt them all that much. Hell, Tangle gets put through one of them, and it feels like it's helping her throughout most of the arc. Okay, maybe that's me not remembering the continuity super well. I think that was like an experimental prototype that she got caught by or something. The arc isn't really all that clear about the portal and the tunnels below the city is, but even when all the characters get brought back from the proper spatial distortion traps, it doesn't feel like they were harmed in any meaningful way. Like, at some point, are these not just a fancy version of tying somebody up? It feels like these are just a way of capturing the heroes, but dressed up to make it look more threatening than it actually is. All of this together makes Eggman's involvement in the arc feel like a bit of a letdown, which really sucks because this is the guy's big comeback after the fucking metal virus. No, literally, look at it. This is the only huge plan to conquer the world Eggman has launched in the comic since the metal virus, and it being such a downgrade when compared to that plan makes it feel like Eggman doesn't have as much of a presence as he should in the comic anymore. Okay, so Eggman's plan is a bit lame, but that alone shouldn't make me rank an arc this low. The real issue in my mind is that none of the emotional arcs that the characters go through really hit home for me. The drama with Tangle naming the Restoration's new strike force the Diamond Cutters feels so melodramatic. And okay, yeah, the comic isn't necessarily a stranger to melodrama, but this just felt so out of place here. This felt like the kind of drama that would show up in an arc like Trial by Fire, or the plot of a Fat issue connecting two bigger major plot points, not the main crux of the emotional arc of some of the most important characters in the arc that's supposed to be Eggman's big comeback after the metal virus, you know? And yeah, there is other stuff going on in the arc outside of that emotional through line, but none of it feels developed because it's a 4-issue arc that has way too many characters running around. Like, seriously, did we really need Sonic and the Diamond Cutters, and Amy, and Blaze, and Silver, and also Team Dark running around with only 4 issues to develop the plot? And on top of that, we also have to develop Eggman's plan and how the weirdly complicated spatial distortion traps work. All this together makes it feel like the arc is just overstuffed with characters and ideas and just does not have the time to execute on any of it. And while other arcs like the Phantom Rider and Metal Virus arcs did have even more characters and plot elements in them, they're also way longer and had other issues to set up a lot of the necessary backstory. The end result is that you have a lot of stuff that happens that's cool and fun to read, but it just isn't emotionally impactful. Like, the entire thing with Shadow is cool and it's pretty well written, but it just doesn't have that much impact for me because Shadow's feelings of inadequacy or whatever was holding it back here weren't set up here or in any other arc of IDW Sonic. All around, the arc is just To be clear, it's still not bad. I don't think any of IDW Sonic is ever worse than just average, but average is the word I would use to describe this arc overall. Is it just me, or is this arc way better than it should be? I have consistently been impressed by how Flynn was able to take these characters that literally no one gave a shit about and make them really entertaining to read. Zavik has consistently been fun in IDW, and his role in some of the other arcs like Bad Guys and the Metal Virus are just great. And the other Zeddy are there. I think that's the nicest thing I've ever said about them, to be honest. The arc also has some really great action and good moments for a lot of the cast. Sonic and Tails are super fun, and seeing them work together in a fight is really nice because we honestly haven't gotten that much in IDW so far, which is surprising. There's just always some plot element that drags these two bros away from each other, it seems. Also, the page where Sonic realizes that he got tricked and he just hauls ass across the entire continent to get back to HQ, and you just see how pissed off he is so good. Also, I really like the subplot where Starline kidnaps Belle. Don't take that out of context, please. It does a great job building up Starline as a greater antagonist for later on. All the stuff with Belle in his lab really hit me in the gut. Now, considering that I've mostly been gushing about the arc so far, you may be a bit weirded out to see this arc so low on my ranking, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it's just because the quality of most of this comic is honestly pretty high, and the other arcs are just better. And the second reason is that, well, As good as Flynn writes them, the Zeti are still the Zeti. They don't really have much history with the other characters or much thematic relevance, and honestly, the lack of thematic relevance really makes me not love this arc as much as I could. The only real thematic relevance to anything in this arc is a rehash of Sonic's moral dilemma in the Metal Virus arc, and it's done worse here than it was there, so yeah. Outside of that, the main plot is kind of just there for an action set piece, and while I love a good action scene in my comic, my tastes are definitely more towards the shonen battle anime style with super complicated powers and all that. That or fight scenes that feel like they have a bit more stakes, where people could genuinely get hurt or possibly get killed off, something a bit more grounded. For me, the fight scenes in IDW Sonic are at a weird middle ground where they aren't grounded enough for me, nor are they elaborate and wacky enough for the anime fan in me, and that's fine for the most part. The comic isn't really about fighting, it just pops up from time to time and is mostly a vehicle for the character drama that really carries most of the stories. But it does kind of feel like this arc leans on its action in a way that a lot of the other arcs don't, and the fact that I don't like the action in IDW Sonic as much as its other elements does hurt the arc in my eyes. All of this together means the arc is really, really fun, but just not as strong in terms of character or plot as a lot of the other better arcs of the comic. Still, I think this is where we go from arcs that are just okay to arcs that are actively good. Yeah, so you know how I just had a whole thing about how I don't find the action in IDW Sonic all that interesting? Well, Battle for Angel Island is another arc that leans pretty heavily on action to carry it, and that does not go over well for me. It's also one of the stranger arcs in the comic because, well, it's the first one. The first 4 or so issues are just dedicated to introducing the characters, and that's fine. It does make it feel a little slow on reread, but that has to happen, and it's woven into the plot really well. It's just that it's a story that only needed like 6 issues to be told that's being stretched into 11 to set up a lot of other stuff for the comic. It doesn't really hurt the arc or anything, but it does make it a bit weirder to talk about. What does really hurt the arc is that there isn't much of an emotional through line for its story. Like, who are we supposed to be feeling for here? Who learns anything in this arc? No one really goes through anything during the climax of the arc, And I say the climax of the arc specifically because the stuff with Mr. Tinker beforehand is way more interesting and compelling. This section of the story actually does have an emotional through line for us to follow, but it gets completely dropped once we start fighting Metal Sonic. The fact that this middle part of the arc is way more interesting and emotional than the actual climax of the arc is kind of a problem in my mind. And while the action in the climax is good, a part of me does feel like the actual final fight against Metal Sonic is a bit lacking. Like, sure, it takes 2 issues to finish the fight, but the majority of those issues are all about building up what a huge threat Metal Sonic is and how dangerous he is now. But then he absorbs the Master Emerald and becomes Master Overlord, and he almost seems weaker because he now has a big glowing Mario Galaxy-ass weak spot that takes Metal out completely as soon as it gets hit. On one hand, I understand why they made this decision, and they do have literally everyone team up to fight him and all that, but the Mario Galaxy weak spot thing feels really lame and nowhere near as clever as some of the ways that characters fight while technically outmatched by their opponent later on in the series. It doesn't make the climax bad, but there are action scenes that I think are way stronger later on. Man, I've kind of just been ragging on this arc so far, haven't I? Okay, let's go over the other good parts of it to show why it's still above like 3 other arcs. Metal Sonic is still really, really cool in this arc, and the fact that it's him in the action scenes as opposed to the awful designs of the Zeti makes them way more fun to look at. The artists and writers are doing all they can with the Zeti, but man, these guys just do not look good. The intrigue with Starline capturing Mr. Tinker is great. Blaze gets to actually do stuff in this arc, and I love that. I'm a big Blaze fan. And the mystery of who's controlling the Eggman Empire is set up really well and is resolved right when it's worn out its welcome, which is great. Really, the arc feels like the main thing holding it back is the fact that it is the first arc in the comic. Not because it has to go around and set things up, but because it doesn't have anything before it to set up its emotional beats and get more depth out of its best segments. Also because the first 4 issues are just Flynn fixing all the terrible character choices from Forces. That's fun. It's not a bad arc, but it's maybe one that's not quite for me. Okay, I am almost certain I'm gonna get some shit for ranking the quote-unquote filler arc over some of these other arcs, but hey, I already said I care more for good character arcs than I do good action. Trial by Fire is a bit of a breather episode, but in a way that I think actually works and is a lot better than what Misadventures does. Despite only being 3 issues worth of story for its main arc, it's able to create some good intrigue and does some meaningful character development. While they are small, all the little arcs that the characters go through in this arc do feel really natural. The drama between Tangle and Jewel here feels so much more appropriate than the thing with the Diamond Cutters as a name in urban warfare, and that's largely just because of the setting and the feeling of the stories themselves. You know, I was fine with the emotional beats of Tangle and Whisper's arguments in urban warfare. The problem was that it was happening during a huge action set piece where the characters should really be putting those kind of petty squabbles aside for the sake of the mission, something that characters did a lot up to that point in the comic. On the other hand, the sort of low-stakes camping trip that only turns into a bit of a mild action set piece later on is a way more natural place for this kind of pretty relatable character drama. Belle coming out of her shell a bit is also great. She's not quite an action hero, but this arc does seem to set her on the path of becoming a more useful member of the Restoration and a better rounded person overall, which is really nice. The only one who doesn't get a really solid character arc out of the story is Amy, and that's fine. Showing off how she keeps everyone together and helps them recover from all the stress, not only of their lives at the moment in general, but also of the forest fire that breaks out during the arc, really shows off a lot of Amy's best character traits. I know there are like some Amy Rose defenders who liked her more exaggerated personality when she was really super obsessed with Sonic, but sorry, you're wrong, this version is way better. Also, the arc doesn't have any really big issues that drag it down in any way. All the character interactions are fun to read and the action is really good. The only problem with the arc, if you were to say there is one, is a lack of scope, but I don't think an arc not having that much scope is that big of a deal. It will make it rank below other arcs that do have more scope and execute on it well in this ranking, but that doesn't make the arc itself bad, you know? And like I said, having some arcs that are a bit more restrained in their scope is good for the overall health of the comic. Oh, this is also one of the first arcs that I've attached a fat chapter to as a part of the arc. Issue 48 follows up on the mystery of who started the fire in this arc and is connected to the following arc by setting up the main villains of that arc, and it's fun to read. It's perfectly good connecting tissue between these 2 larger arcs, and it's also really efficient in terms of telling that story, which is nice because it means we can get to the larger arcs more quickly. Honestly, re-binging the rest of the comic just keeps hammering home for me just how bad the Misadventures arc is structurally. I just don't understand why it took them that long to tell that little story, and I promise I'll stop beating this dead horse now. And, you know, with all that said, Trial by Fire is a really fun arc, it's just beaten out by the larger scope of the other arcs in this comic. So this is probably the first arc where I really have to explain why I'm cutting off the arcs where I am. Because I could see a lot of people arguing that they should be 2 separate arcs and not one. So much so that I did actually originally write them down as 2 different arcs when I was setting up this video, but the longer I thought about it, the more I thought this setup made more sense. The main reason I came to that conclusion is that the thrust of both of these stories, in my eyes at least, is Belle's emotional journey as she comes to grip with who her father is and the reality that he's not really gonna come back. When I was thinking about when certain stories had begun or ended, I tried to think about what emotional through lines were being established and resolved and at what times, and Belle's backstory is really the driving force behind all of the emotional elements of these 2 stories. The second reason, and the one I think is a little more out there, is that I would have to rank this arc a lot lower if they were 2 arcs instead of 1, like below Zeddy Hunt probably, and I don't think that accurately reflects how I feel about this story. I think Belle's character growth in this arc is really, really good, but it's split pretty evenly between both half stories in the arc. The stuff at White Park sets up Belle's denial and anxiety about the whole affair, and the test chamber section is her coming to terms with all of that pain. Without both halves of this story, neither one really works, and the rest of the plot that happens in these sections isn't really compelling enough to stand on its own. Not to mention that Belle gets a lot of screen time in both sections, so not being able to rate this whole character arc as a part of the quality of these stories would be really awful. Now, all of these issues are caused purely by my choice of format to talk about this comic in, and while I am aware of that, I also don't care enough to change what I'm doing. So yeah, we're rating these as 1 arc, and you can complain about it in the comments if you disagree. In fact, I'm sure there's going to be some good points out there, and I look forward to reading them. Okay, so on to Belle and why I think her journey here is really compelling. Her denial throughout most of the White Park section, slowly giving way to determination to actually meet Eggman and confirm for herself what happened, feels really natural. It's the type of cognitive dissonance that's really common in real life, but is very difficult to actually write convincingly. And that scene where she confronts Eggman is just so brutal. Having to watch Belle listen to her former father just go on and on about the unrestrained cruelty of his inventions and how magnificent it all is, and then just seeing how devastating it is for her is genuinely emotional. I really appreciate the decision to let the art carry Belle's emotions here instead of just having her say how she feels. It makes her confession on the biplane later on even more powerful, and these panels alone already tell us so much without any words. On the other hand, the rest of the stuff in the arc just doesn't hold up to how good Belle's journey is. The White Park and Test Chamber sections are both pretty underwhelming in different ways. White Park is a really fun setting with a fun plot that's done kind of poorly, while Test Chambers is an alright idea that's only executed okay. While Eggman creating a pocket dimension where he can fuck with the laws of physics as he pleases is really cool, it doesn't actually amount to all that much. The final action set piece is just a fight against a bunch of robots, and at that point, why even come up with this awesome set piece if you're not going to use it? Again, that's not to say the action is bad here, it's good, it's a good action scene, it's just not as cool as it could have been. Meanwhile, White Park's plot and setting are a stroke of genius that they kind of fumbled in a few key ways. This entire section of the arc has a ton of small, weird continuity issues that at least took me out of the story on a second read through. Okay, so the arc shows Sonic and Tails as well as Amy, Rouge, and Cream showing up at White Park and Eggman's base at around the same time. But then a full day and some change passes with Amy's crew while Sonic and Tails are just kind of hanging out at the base and I'm sorry, are you saying it took Tails a full day to hack that terminal and they didn't know Belle there until hours and hours had already passed? That's kind of silly. Also, what was Starline's plan here? Why didn't he just run away with Tails after he had successfully captured him? Isn't he supposed to be trying to not imitate Eggman's more theatrical attributes at this point? And this isn't even they can't have the villains do that because it wouldn't be appropriate for a kid's comic moment, because he didn't want to kill Tails or anything. He just wanted to kidnap him for his DNA. They kidnap people all the time in this comic. Again, all of these are continuity nitpicks, and a lot of people probably won't be bothered by them at all. Personally, I consider pointing out continuity issues the lowest form of criticism, but sometimes they are a bit jarring. Still, as much as I've been nitpicking the White Park section of the story, I like it a lot more than the Test Chamber section just because the parts that do work here are really good. For instance, this is where we get to meet Clutch, and I love that guy. He's a great villain. Overall, the continuity issues and the Test Chamber's action scene not being that great and all this other stuff kind of does drag down the arc a little bit for me, despite the fact that I think that Belle's journey through it is stronger than some of the other stuff in later arcs. Guys, remember when Mimic was cool? Yeah, I miss it too. Anyway, this miniseries is a great introduction to both Tangle and Whisper as characters, as well as one of the most hateable villains in the entire comic, and it's really good. Whisper's backstory is really good, and I totally buy her and Tangle growing closer and Tangle helping her to come out of her shell. TBH, making Tangle and Whisper quote-unquote best friends was a great decision. They bounce off of each other really well, and I feel like this miniseries kind of proves that these two could carry an entire comic on their own if they ever felt like doing that. The main thing holding this miniseries down for being higher up on the list is that it kind of spends a lot of time doing exposition as opposed to just telling a story. This is largely because it was so early on in the comics run, so like the Battle for Angel Island arc, it has to spend some time setting things up and explaining what's going on, but unlike Angel Island, which could just add extra issues on the back end to be able to tell more story in the same arc, as a miniseries, they only had 4 issues to work with. If this same story were being done now, as opposed to at the start of the run, I feel like they would have at least done it in 3 issues only at most, or maybe package in a B-plot to fill in the rest of the 4 issues. But instead, the first issue was filled with extra explanations about Tangle and Jewel's friendship, and also Tangle and Whisper's past exploits, and also establishing who Mimic is. And while that's not all that much, it's time that other arcs in the comic were able to use better developing their themes and ideas instead of just explaining stuff. Now, honestly, I've been complaining a little bit too much for an arc that I actually do like a lot, so let's go ahead and get to the thing that really made me love this arc. Its villain, Mimic. And God, this arc sells Mimic as a villain so well, and I'm still a little salty that he hasn't been used quite as well since then. The thing that makes Mimic so great in this first arc isn't that he's a hateable scumbag who you can't wait to see finally get what's coming to him, or even that his motivations are actually some of the more down-to-earth and relatable of any of the villains in the comic thus far, but that he's genuinely actually smart in this first arc. I actually got tricked by him for a little while when he disguises himself as Whisper and locks Tangle in the safe. It's so well set up because before that, the last time we see Mimic was when he transformed into Jewel. So when Whisper and Tangle hear Jewel in the building, we obviously know it's Mimic and that Tangle is getting tricked. But seeing through that part of his ruse actually just makes you put your guard down, so that when Whisper shows up next to Tangle, you assume it's her despite the signs that it's actually Mimic in disguise. And while I did figure this out before I flipped the page over to the reveal, the fact that I was ever so briefly tricked by him made me want to see more of Mimic immediately. Like, this type of villain is honestly really tropey, and I've seen it so many times, and eventually you sort of just start to get it. It's not helped by the fact that this comic is for kids, so they can't do anything all that crazy with the twist, or they'll risk leaving the younger members of the audience behind, at least not without some more setup. Even with all of that going against it, the fact that this twist is so well set up that it actually kind of got me for a second, despite my familiarity with this kind of trope, immediately sold me on Mimic as a character. Outside of this trick, all of Mimic's lies and tricks in the arc are really well crafted. They're not that crazy, but they make perfect sense and do a really good job of selling Mimic as this crafty backstabber. I know that there are some people out there that don't like that Eggman kind of undercuts him in the latter half of the arc and shows that he's not really all that untouchable, but honestly, that just made me like him more. The fact that Mimic is fallible and easily overtaken by other more powerful villains, again, just makes him feel more real and makes his motivations even more believable. He's not some larger-than-life figure. He's just a crafty son of a bitch who will do absolutely anything he has to survive, as twisted as his idea of survival has become after all the shit he's gone through. If you haven't read the latest annual, that bit probably won't make that much sense, but we get some more of his thought process there, and suffice to say, this Tentacle Boy has a whole lot of baggage. I know I didn't actually talk that much about Tangle and Whisper in this section, despite the fact that this miniseries is named after them, but it's mostly because we get a ton of them in the comics and they're consistently great. So I don't have a ton to say just about how they're portrayed in this arc specifically. They're great for all the reasons that Tangle and Whisper are usually great. Overall, I think the arc is about as strong as Bell's in terms of emotional beats, but with an overall more solid plot and structure, as well as way more interesting set of action set pieces and a great showing for one of the comic's most underutilized villains. I would say that a lot of arcs and issues in IDW Sonic are kind of carried by the art and their general vibes. There's a reason it's hard for me to actually say I dislike any of the issues of this comic, and that's because they're always full of great art of characters I really love. This is all to say that the vibes are on point, but they all kind of pale in comparison to the sheer majesty that is the immaculate vibes of Scrapnik Island. The art in this miniseries creates this moody and desolate feeling that nothing else in the comic even comes close to replicating. Scrapnik Island leans on its art to tell its story so much more than any other arc of this comic, and I think that was a great decision for the story it was trying to tell. The plot of the arc is largely about Mecha Sonic and their journey of self-acceptance and finding purpose, and all of that stuff is done really well. But the thing that really carries all of the emotions it's trying to get out of the reader is the way it balances the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the island with the more sentimental and almost nostalgic feeling it simultaneously wants to evoke. The island is obviously a difficult place to live, to the point where the audience never once questions why Mecha Sonic and the other residents want to leave. But at the same time, there's this really sweet vibe of found family between all the Scrapniks that makes Mecha Sonic announcing that the other Scrapniks were never his friends feel devastating. I kind of wish I knew more about art theory because it's genuinely incredible how the art manages to make the island feel so unwelcoming and scary while also feeling wistful and nostalgic at the same time. This is the best art in IDW Sonic so far, and I don't think it's very close. And keep in mind when I say that I think the art in this comic is genuinely amazing overall. It's just that this miniseries somehow elevates the art to a completely different level. A part of me feels like that's intentional because there are so many more panels in this arc without any speech bubbles in them at all. The art is telling the story here, and I kind of feel bad that I don't have the vocabulary to properly express how good of a job it does at that. With all the gushing about the art out of the way, I also need to talk about Mecha Sonic's story in the arc. Unfortunately, that stuff just didn't seem to resonate with me as much as it did with other people. For one, it kind of feels similar to Belle's arc, but this time without the same level of emotional intelligence that Belle's had. While a lot of Scrapneck Island's story is told silently through visuals rather than text, they unfortunately seem to rely on text in areas where I think visual storytelling would have been more effective. Connecting Sonic and Mecha Sonic's minds is a really cool idea and does lead to a lot of good storytelling, but I do feel like some of these moments were less effective than the ones that preceded them. Specifically, I'm thinking about when Mecha and Sonic are in the scrap grinder and about to get killed. Mecha Sonic's monologue in this scene just feels so heavy-handed and on the nose, and it's not like it doesn't work, but I feel like it could have worked better. And honestly, part of me is a bit underwhelmed by yet another story about a character who has low self-worth and needs to learn to love themselves once again in this comic. I mean, that really is just nitpicking. That's not that big of a complaint, but it did sour my experience while reading it through for the first time. The scene ultimately does work really well, and I just think that other moments in the comic were more resonant and more powerful, which is why they're being ranked above it. Still, I'm ranking this as the 5th best arc in the comic for a reason. It's a really, really good story. I'm probably never gonna forget how I felt when I first got to the These Aren't My Tears panel. That shit was so good. It's a great miniseries overall for a ton of reasons, and while it didn't hit me as hard as it could have, if someone came up to me and said that this was their favorite part of IDW or even just their favorite Sonic comic, I would completely understand. Bad Guys is a bit of a strange arc. On one hand, you could say that not all that much actually happens here. Despite spending so much time with these characters, none of them get all that much development in this arc. But on the other hand, that's kind of the point. This miniseries does such a good job of setting up Starline's villainous plans and establishing why all these characters are such great villains. And rereading it now with some more context for where all these characters go in the future, this arc is so revealing in hindsight. Bad Guys didn't feel like the 4th best arc of the series when I first read it, but rereading it a second time for this series really made me appreciate just how smart a lot of the writing in this arc is. Let's actually talk about those titular bad guys for a second, starting with Rough and Tumble, because this miniseries made me like them a lot more than I did beforehand. For the most part, before this, they were just functional characters in my mind, but this arc is the start of them being legitimately funny and charming characters. They're maybe the most sympathetic villains in the series just because the amount of damage they actually do is so low. Hell, they even got their redemption arc before Surgeon Kit did. They're also a great choice for this story because they're a perfect counterexample to each of the other villains in the Deadly Four, which, now that I think about it, is kind of a weird name because there are 5 of them? I guess Zavik just considers Rough and Tumble one person, which is a little weird, but they don't object to it, so I guess they're cool with it. Anyway, the point of these two in this story is to have their naivety and honestly their innocence clash against the more sinister villains on the team. Rough and Tumble aren't evil, they're just making some bad decisions with their life, and you can tell because of how differently they approach this entire team up. They are, and I stress, the only ones who didn't enter this agreement expecting and planning to betray the others from the very beginning. And the fact that these guys even start to distrust the others really shows how all the other villains are reaping what they're sowing. By himself, Mimic isn't all that interesting in this arc, he's kind of just there to bounce off of Zavik, but he's written perfectly here. He's a perfect combination of a ruthless, backstabbing scumbag and an affable, kind of pathetic loser, and I love him. He has good chemistry with the other characters, and he's super fun to read, but most of the actual heavy lifting in the plot is done by Starline and Zavik. This is, and I'm gonna be real, Zavik's best showing in the comic. He is still the same ruthless jerk that he is in the rest of the comic, but this lets us see a different side of him because now we get to see how he acts around his allies rather than just his enemies. And I am including the rest of the Deadly Six in that statement because those guys are just not terribly interesting characters. Zavik's pep talk to Starline and Starline's ensuing self-reflection is really well done. Not just because it's perfectly in character and natural, but it's also a great setup for Starline's arc. You can just see how Starline is learning all of the wrong lessons from what Zavik says. The only bit of advice that really sticks is when Zavik says that Starline can surpass Eggman, and that's because it feeds Starline's ego. Everything else is completely discarded. You know, as abusive and shitty as Zavik is, I do feel like he at least has some level of respect for the rest of the Deadly Six. There's something there that explains why they follow him, besides just his physical strength. And Zavik does try to get Starline to understand that, but Starline learns all the wrong things. He doesn't learn to find partners that he respects or cares about, which we can tell from how he's totally fine with betraying his teammates at the end of the arc and doesn't even flinch at the realization that they knew he was backstabbing them and decided to double backstab him back. Try saying that 5 times fast. All he learns is that real people are often more powerful than machines. They're more flexible, and that's what Starlight is interested in creating after his time with Zavik. He still sees his future creation, Surge and Kit, as tools and not people, and that fact is ultimately what leads them to betray him. Once again, his lack of trust in others screwing him over and leading to his eventual death. In some sense, the arc doesn't have the same strong emotional beats as the other arcs, nor is the action all that special for the comic, but that's why the arc is so much better in hindsight specifically. While it itself doesn't contain any emotional moments, rereading the arc now has this amazing sense of dramatic irony. It's almost haunting to watch Starline prepare not only to ruin Surge and Kit's lives, but also to set up for his own downfall in real time. I can't help but wonder while reading it if just a few things had worked out differently. If maybe he had chosen different allies for this mission, then maybe none of the ensuing pain and tragedy would have happened at all. You kinda have to ask if this was actually avoidable or not. Maybe Starline could have avoided his death, but maybe this is just too integral to who he is as a person. Maybe this is just how it was always going to turn out. It's a type of storytelling that I feel like we can only really get from an arc like this and this kind of comic. One focused on the heroes, but on the bad guys and understanding exactly what makes them tick. Maybe I'm overrating it a little bit, but I kind of think it deserves to be this high up. I'm gonna be real, I was kinda surprised to rank this arc so highly. At first, it feels like it doesn't stack up to the rest of the arcs we've talked about so far. I mean, it doesn't have any huge emotional revelations for any of the characters, right? It doesn't have a pivotal plot role to play, it's mostly just a fun adventure with Sonic and his buddies, right? Well, that's sort of what I thought right after finishing the arc and before I went back to reread the rest of the comic. But now that we're a few weeks out and I've had time to properly digest it, I realized that this arc was a lot better than I originally assumed. First off, I have to let you guys know I grew up playing way too much Sonic Riders. Not only was I huge into that game, I was also really into Tony Hawk games as a kid too. I was deep in the extreme sports craze of the 2000s, so this entire arc is like a concentrated shot of nostalgia directly into my neck. Not only is it great to see the rogues in the extreme gear again, but the arc's entire sense of style is so much fun and it genuinely makes me wish the Sonic Riders series was still going. I love seeing all the characters back in their Riders gear. I love seeing all the new Riders outfits. And they gave Surge fucking Kamina glasses, which is an inspired choice. The entire arc just has some of the most fun vibes all around, and I genuinely love it just for that. On top of having some of the most fun art in the comic, this is also maybe the funniest arc in the comic so far, which is something that I don't really think about when ranking these arcs, but it's crazy how consistently this arc made me laugh. Sonic is a very quippy character, and that energy leaks into the rest of the franchise as well, but a lot of the time I don't actually vibe with the jokes in the comics or in a lot of the games, honestly. It often feels more like the writers are going through the motions, like, well, Sonic is a character that makes quips, so we have to come up with something mildly clever for him to say here. But this arc is consistently, genuinely funny, and it's maybe the only section of the comic where I can say that. Now, while I did love reading this arc, there were a few parts of the arc that were disappointing to me, specifically a lot of the stuff with Clutch. Like, seriously, why is Clutch sometimes this super competent badass and other times a complete fucking idiot? Why does he yell out the name of his undercover shapeshifter agent who he knows is working directly with the enemy faction's strike force? Is he stupid? And for the love of God, can we please stop doing the "I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die" trope? Monsters Inc. was the only time it ever felt clever or earned at all, and in this version it's even dumber because Clutch knows that Knight is actively broadcasting when he runs over and incriminates himself in front of everyone, and it's so dumb. It was genuinely so very annoying that this is how they chose to have Clutch fall from grace in this comic, considering how intimidating he is up to that point in the arc. Also, all the drama with Mimic and the Diamond Cutters is still not great. Not because of anything in this arc, just because it was set up poorly. The arc does the best it can with the story that was written beforehand, and they do some clever stuff here and there, but I really don't think there's anything that could have been done to fix this story completely. Okay, all of that stuff aside, the arc actually had a lot of other stuff that was really great. Despite having a ton of characters running around doing things, nothing feels rushed here. Outside of a few things with Clutch being stupid, it feels like every character's story and every decision they make makes perfect sense. The arc also has this great growing sense of tension throughout its entire run. It starts out as this fun, silly feeling arc with an undertone of subterfuge thanks to Clutch's presence, but it slowly builds and raises the stakes over and over until the entire arc ends with a shuttle about to fall onto the heads of an entire city of innocent people. And unlike a lot of other arcs, it feels like once the tension builds to that point, it's still appropriately difficult for the heroes to actually save the day. A ton of different characters have to work together in fun and clever ways to minimize the damage that the situation is going to cause. Honestly, this arc is probably Jewel's best showing as a character so far. The fact that they had Jewel actually look at the falling ship and decide it was better to have it crash on the Restoration HQ because less lives would be lost was genuinely shocking to me when I first read it. For a comic that's so saccharine and optimistic most of the time, having a character, a hero, make a decision this utilitarian and cold-blooded honestly felt hauntingly real. Jewel is also maybe the only character on the hero side of things that I could see actually making this kind of decision. She's not some action hero who saves the day no matter what. She's just a normal person who's managing the resources at her disposal as best she can, and sometimes that requires making hard choices. You know, I don't necessarily know if I want Sonic or any of the other characters to give up on their more idealistic outlooks on life where they try to save everyone no matter what, but having a character who is down to earth enough to make those kinds of decisions on their side is really great. This entire segment feels like it gave Jewel so much more depth as a character, and I'm all here for it. Also, we get a ton of great development for Surge and Kit here. I love that they're slowly becoming better people without actually just turning a new leaf the way Sonic wants them to. It's a perfect way to set them up as these sort of false heroes that exist as an antithesis to Sonic's philosophy. This is also expanded upon in the 2024 annual, but you can see just from this how Surge and Kit are growing into these sort of twisted, selfish heroes that are eerily reminiscent of what Starline wanted for them, but still something that's their own decision. While none of these emotional beats are quite as strong as some of the other moments in the comic, having these character arcs that are so naturally building off of what came before is really great development for the comic's overall plot. It's one of the most fun arcs in the comic, and it builds up a lot more than what it feels like at first glance. So yeah, I do think this is my third favorite arc in the comics run, despite its numerous flaws. I feel like the Metal Virus arc is kind of a shoo-in for the number one spot. It's just so long and heavy and emotional. It has all this great action, and when you're reading it, it just feels like this is the best thing that this comic has to offer. I could spend just so much time gushing about why this arc is so impactful and why it's beloved by the fandom, and I will do a bit of that, but not too much, because if you're watching this video, you probably already know why this arc is great. The thing is, this is one of the only arcs in the comic's entire run that I actually liked less on my second reading. While you're reading the Metal Virus arc, it feels like this massive, earth-shattering event that will fundamentally change literally everything about the world and the characters that went through it. Several characters essentially had to watch their loved ones die in front of them, and those scenes are so effective at selling the emotions of the characters. I could go on and on about why these individual scenes are so good, and they do a great job in each of them of giving these characters the respect they deserve. Except for Shadow, he kind of got done dirty, honestly. But I'm just going to focus on one of these moments, my absolute favorite one of these scenes from the entire arc. Watching Cream accept that she's infected by the Metal Virus. I genuinely tear up every time I read this part. Cream has already gone through so much at this point in the arc. She had to lose her pets/friends, and then she lost her mom, and then she had to watch a ton of her other friends get infected as well, which is already a lot for anyone to go through. But keep in mind that this girl is 6 years old. She's a child, and she's being way stronger and dealing with way more than anyone, no matter their age, should be expected to have to deal with in such a short span of time. But even after all of that tragedy, once Cream realizes that she's infected, she knows that she's a danger to others, and she decides that she needs to do the right thing. It's really gut-wrenching, but being a sad scene in the Metal Virus arc isn't all that special. What makes this scene stick in my mind as so powerful is how Gimmerl reacts to this news. Watching him just toss the Chaos Emerald into the portal and then turn to Cream and say, "I will stay with you until you are well," is so powerful. Finally, after all the hardship Cream has gone through, after spending so long trying to be strong for everyone else's sake, Gimmerl lets Cream know that she doesn't have to keep trying anymore. She doesn't have to keep being there for everyone else to lean on. She can lean on him now. It's an amazing scene, and despite how heavy the topic is, it feels completely earned in a Sonic the Hedgehog comic of all things. I can't believe they made a scene where a 6-year-old girl gets comforted about catching a terminal disease and having to sit there and wait for it to kill her feel appropriate for a Sonic the Hedgehog comic, but they somehow did, and it's amazing. This is, in my mind, the highlight of the arc's emotional scenes, but it's not the only good one, and it's a perfect example of how powerful and emotional the arc is when you first read it. But there is a bit of an asterisk to all of this. While all these emotional beats do feel so huge and powerful when you read them, the entire arc does feel like it's a bit cheapened to me simply because there are no permanent consequences to just about anything that happens in it. Like, okay, the metal virus does cause the forest fire and trial by fire and whatnot, but like, none of these death scenes are actually death scenes. None of the pain and strife in the arc is actually permanent. It's all just kind of whisked away by the Chaos Emeralds and the Warp Topaz in the finale, and maybe I'm being weird about that, but it makes all of these scenes throughout the entire arc feel less meaningful to me. I mean, yeah, okay. It was established pretty early on that the condition could be reversible, and Tails was close to finding a vaccine, and the characters say multiple times, "Once we find a way to fix all this mess," but the arc also goes out of its way multiple times to dash those hopes just as much as it raises them. Tails fails to make the vaccine, Sonic loses his magic wrist fit, and that stops him from making a new one, and eventually we learn that even if they could get the data back, Sonic is no longer capable of fighting off the metal virus anyway, so that vaccine probably wouldn't work. So much of the arc is dedicated to making you feel hopeless, making you feel like there's no escape from this massive tragedy, and showing why holding on to as much hope as you can anyway is so important. And all of that just being magically solved by the Chaos Emeralds over the course of, like, what was it, 2 issues, just feels cheap. And other arcs don't feel this way. I mean, look at the Phantom Rider arc. It kept building up this more and more imposing situation over the course of its runtime. And yeah, the way Clutch got exposed was a bit lame, but the sequence where they had to stop the shuttle from falling on the city is so tense. And more importantly, for our purposes here, the sacrifice Jewel had to make at the end of the arc is permanent and real in a way that the sacrifices in a lot of the Metal Virus arc really aren't. Restoration HQ is gone. Silver's Garden is gone, and even if they can rebuild and find a new office afterward, that pain is still there. The lack of permanence of the metal virus also bleeds into the other big theme throughout the story, which is whether or not Sonic's decision to spare Mr. Tinker was right. At multiple points in the story, characters make it clear that this is, in some sense, a result of Sonic's actions. The reason why the scenes where Espio and Shadow get mad at Sonic work so well is because we, as the audience, also feel the pain that's making them this angry. But all of that pain is retroactively cheapened by the fact that everyone is completely okay at the end of the arc. Espio's anger and feelings of betrayal are reasonable, but they aren't quite as big as they first seem. Charmy and Vector haven't really been hurt by this because as long as they manage to fix the situation, they'll be fine. Espio hasn't lost anything yet. And that makes the whole dilemma that Sonic is going through feel a bit lopsided. The opposing argument to Sonic isn't Eggman could permanently hurt or kill people if you spare him, it's only Eggman could hatch a new zany plan that you have to stop. And those are not even close to the same question, and one of them is way less compelling than the other. All of that just kind of makes the Metal Virus arc feel less big and less grand than it did when I first experienced it. However, with all of that said, this doesn't even come close to ruining the arc or anything. It's a small blemish, a tiny flaw that makes me not love the arc quite as much as I initially did when I first read it, whereas the last arc on this only seems to get better in my eyes as the comic continues. Why yes, Surge is my favorite character in this comic, how could you tell? Okay, jokes aside, this arc is amazing, and I do think it deserves a top spot on this list on the merits of its storytelling alone. I think before I get into the story itself, I should justify why I'm calling this one arc as opposed to two. I think some people would maybe chop these arcs into two around the point where Surge and Sonic finish their first fight and before Surge gets the dynamo cage, but these things flow into each other so naturally that I really don't think I can rank them separately. I mean, I thought that Belle's backstory being explained across those two separate stories was enough to call them one arc. You think I'm going to chop this one in half? So with all that said, allow me to explain to you why this is the absolute best shit in all of IDW Sonic. I'm just going to warn you guys now, this is going to be a lot of me gushing, and I'm not even sure how much meaningful analysis is in this. The journey that Surge and Kit go on from being these test subjects just following orders to finding out the horrible truth behind their creation to bonding and becoming siblings who would do literally anything to protect each other is as touching as it is sad. Surge and Kit's relationship is something I could write an entire video about. Despite the fact that the two of them honestly do care about each other and want to protect each other, by the end of the story they're still in a position where their pair are hurting each other more than they're helping. They both enable the other's worst tendencies. They constantly reinforce the other's most self-destructive behavior and are both fundamentally so attached to each other and so terrified of trusting anybody else that they may never be able to actually move on and grow past that pain. I think the most chilling thing about the relationship is the fact that basically all of these emotional imbalances are by design. Things literally programmed into them by Starline, which is also extremely telling. The thing is, Starline is not actually a people smart person as much as he thinks that he is. I don't think all of this is just Starline trying to control the two of them. A lot of it is, sure, but I think a lot of these dysfunctions are the result of how Starline views relationships. Starline views relationships as transactional. He's incapable of meaningful trust, and so he built Surge and Kit not as people who trust and love each other, but as a hero and her tool which he needs to use to reach her full potential, because that's how he thinks relationships work. And if I can be honest, I think Surge and Kit's desperation for validation also probably comes at least in part from Starline's fucking insane desire to be acknowledged by Eggman. It was a desire so deep and cancerous, it literally leads him to follow the path to his own undoing. I can't help but think that he also put a bit of that complex into the two people that he made. And from this foundation, we get so many amazing emotional moments from this arc. Starline's death is somehow extremely satisfying and tragic. Like, he did have this coming, but also it's kind of hard to say that anyone actually deserves this. Kit receiving the news that Surge was dead was handled really well. Surge dealing with the hallucinations of Starline constantly mocking her, the panic she feels when she realizes Eggman and Sonic are working together and that she's not strong enough to protect herself and Kit. That fucking soul-crushing scene where Kit runs up and hugs Surge while Starline is telling her that he owns her and that she can never outrun her own head. And all of that builds to the moment when Surge says that she can't be free as long as Sonic is alive. When she just looks straight forward and all of the anger and hate fades away and all you can see is the deep sadness and pain that's driving her to do this. And that just builds to the scene where Kit says that nobody actually cares about them, that everybody just wants to use them. And so he lifts Surge out of the bunker, saying that they're finally going to leave their past behind in a panel that is so cool, but somehow so soul-crushing at the same time. I think it should be pretty clear by now just how much this part of the comic really moved me. I honestly can't even look at these panels without remembering all the feelings this story stirred in me when I first read it. And all of this emotion is used to great effect to say something that's really powerful in the context of this comic. Surge and Kit are thus far the absolute best thematic counterexamples to Sonic's philosophy in IDW Sonic. This arc, once again, like Metal Virus and Zeddy Hunt, tries to challenge Sonic's belief that he should give people infinite chances at redemption no matter what they do. The reason this time it hits so much harder is that, in my eyes, this is the first time we've seen Sonic's philosophy lead to permanent, unchangeable consequences up to this point. As far as Surge and Kit are concerned, if Sonic wasn't constantly letting Eggman run free after defeating him, they would have never been created, and that makes their existence, at some level, Sonic's fault. That's not something you can fix with a simple speech, you know? And on the topic of permanent consequences, Starline literally dying is a pretty big consequence. I mean, sure, the guy was an irredeemable piece of shit who was never actually going to change, but so is Eggman. Eggman has done way worse than Starline ever has at this point in the comic, and letting Eggman go over and over did, to some extent, lead to Starline's death. Now, to be clear, I don't think that these arguments are actually correct. I don't actually think that you can say what Starline and Eggman did are Sonic's fault, and I understand why Sonic does what he does in the context of the comic. These objections shouldn't be enough to change his opinion, but they are still strong objections, and the stronger the objection, the more compelling the conflict between these ideas are. Also, I do want to talk about Sonic's behavior towards Surge in their first fight, because I think it's kind of interesting. Later on in the arc, Kit says that Sonic and Eggman are both only interested in using the two of them, that they don't actually care about them as people. And usually when a character says something like this, I kind of just roll my eyes. The heroes have typically already shown that they do genuinely care about the people they rescue, so the problem is always just the person saying that doesn't know them well enough yet. But I think it holds more weight here. Sonic is like really dismissive towards Surge in their first encounter. It's not too bad on its own, but when you compare it to Tails' approach and how much more effective it is, it's really striking just how much Sonic doesn't take any time to try and understand Surge at all. Tails goes out of his way to learn who Kid is and try to comfort him, whereas Sonic just assumes he knows what Surge's deal is immediately and says that she'll get over it. Sonic really doesn't care about Surge's feelings at this point, and that's part of why the situation escalates as much as it does. It's honestly pretty refreshing to see Sonic not be obviously right about literally everything in one of these comics. Like, sure, he does still have the moral high ground and everything, but he hasn't done right by Surge at this point in the story specifically. And just for the record, I don't think that Sonic being better towards Surge here would have stopped her from acting how she did. She made the decision to act this way on her own, and that's not Sonic's fault. I guess I'm just saying that I think Sonic could have handled the situation better. So, yeah, that's why Operation Remaster is easily the best arc in the comic. It's more emotionally and thematically powerful than every other arc, and I think it has the best action scenes as well, for what that's worth. Operation Remaster perfectly sets up who I believe are currently the most compelling antagonists in the comic, while also telling a really, really powerful story all on its own. All while not overstaying its welcome at all. It's pretty much perfect in my eyes, it just barely takes the top spot away from the Metal Virus arc, and I'm really excited to see if the IDW Sonic team ever finds a way to top this. And that is the ranking. That's just my opinion, obviously, and while that should go without saying, there are people on the internet who are weird about assuming that you're trying to say something is objectively true when subjectivity should be implied. I am also working on another video about Sonic, so if you're interested in hearing me yap about this franchise even more, you can go ahead and subscribe. Also, leave a comment if you have literally anything to say. I love arguing with people on the internet because I've lost control of my life, so I'll probably have a chat with you about it. And with all that said, thanks for watching.